Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. Today we have a very special guest for this podcast. We have the 33rd Governor of Wyoming, Governor Mark Gordon. He was elected in November 2018. Welcome, Governor. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today. And we're grateful you were able to take time away from your schedule to join us. Because you've been governor for about 6.5 years. I think a lot of people know about your background, but let's visit it anyway. We actually have a lot of listeners who are from out of state and even international. Pretty sure Mark Northam's still listening, the former director of SER from Norway. So for those folks, tell us about where did you grow up?
Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be here, Holly, and it's great to have a conversation. I grew up in Casey, Wyoming, which was a town still about 286 people. At the time, there was a local school in a community called Mayworth. There really weren't any high schools in Casey, but that's where I grew up, on a ranch. We used to do all the stuff ranch kids do. That includes lots of work, but it also includes things like fishing and getting out in the hills.
So where did you go to school, and what did you study in school?
Well, graduated from Middlebury College. It was a ski thing. I had wanted to go to the University of Wyoming, which had a phenomenal ski team at the time. I was a ski jumper, and I didn't speak Norwegian, which made it pretty hard for me to get on. If you understand, Norwegian jumpers at that time were much better than American jumpers, and so Middlebury was a great opportunity. I studied history just because I have a fascination for that. But actually, Middlebury had some really wonderful courses, something called Northern Studies. It was all about sort of economies in northern hemispheres being dependent on the conditions of the environment and everything else.
And what was your career before you got into politics?
So, varied career, went back to the ranch, still run the ranch, still have the family ranch I grew up on, but we also have our own, Jenny and I. Set up a mail-order business during the downturn of the 1980s in Wyoming when prices were depressed. We'd gone to a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and it was really hard for oil and gas and a number of other things. We took advantage of a review that what became my boss, Raymond Plank for Apache Corporation, put together something called the Wyoming Futures Project. And in it said, you have these C-suite people that are in Wyoming with the coal and the oil and gas industries, but they're all married to very bright women. So my wife and I and a number of very bright women set up this mail-order business for travel goods. Had that for a while, then we had our children and sold the business. Had a bookshop for a while, owned a movie theater for a while, so all of these things kind of tangential. Eventually got hired by Raymond Plank and Apache Corporation as the Director of Conservation and Stewardship, which I always thought was funny because somebody said, boy, that's going to be a big business card that you've got there with that title. But ran that, did a lot of work with Apache on basically stewardship and management. So
it's funny. We never know where our careers are going to go.
That's exactly right. I often talk about the fact that, if you're going to graduate from school, I think all of us have thoughts of where we're going to be, but it kind of changes, and I think we should be flexible and take what we get.
Yep, absolutely. That's what we tell our students all the time. So governor wasn't your first role in Wyoming state government. So tell our listeners how you came to be Wyoming state treasurer and what you gained from that experience that you bring with you today into being governor.
Well, thanks. Friend of mine, former treasurer Meyer, not the current treasurer Meyer, passed away in office. Jenny and I happened to be moving heifers that day on the mountain. And she said, Mark, you've always been interested in serving the state. Maybe there's something in this for you. I had just finished, I hadn't quite finished, I had to finish quickly, a term on the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. I was a Class B director, which is the small business category. Came down, talked with Governor Meade, got selected, and served in that capacity for 6 years.
Wow. And so doing research for this podcast, I wasn't aware of this before. When you were Wyoming treasurer, Wyoming sovereign funds earned a #1 ranking for the United States and #3 in the world for transparency, which is something given by the Peterson Institute. So talk about that. How was it achieved, and why is it important?
Sure. Well, the Peterson Institute's well respected internationally for sort of management of funds and how they're done. You have to look back at the history of Wyoming. So in the 60s, we had a really tough time. There was a proposal of a severance tax. Governor Stan Hathaway said he would never do that unless we also had a permanent mineral trust fund. Both of those things were passed in the 70s, and they have accrued over time. Initially, it just held bonds, and there really wasn't any effort to get the interest on it. But in the 90s, there was an effort to kind of be able to diversify a little bit into stocks, which was interesting for our Constitution because we're not supposed to invest in any capital stock under 16.6 of the provision. Treasurer Stan Smith kind of fought with that for a while. Then along came Cynthia Lummis, who did a really good job kind of saying, how do we modernize this portfolio? Treasurer Meyer, the one that passed away in office, followed her. And then I picked up where that was. And our interest was, how do we make sure that this nest egg, people don't remember the fact that it was really visionary, I think, of the politicians in the 60s and the 70s to say, we're going to mine and produce all of this wonderful wealth out of Wyoming's ground. We want to leave something for our subsequent generations, and they should have a piece of it. So we're going to take that as our severance tax, but we're also going to set it aside in this sovereign wealth fund that will be able to benefit those future generations with investments. So when I came on board, it was a marginally performing portfolio. Thought we could add to it, hired Patrick Fleming, really engaged with how do we do the best job we can for the people of Wyoming, number one, and number two, how do we make it absolutely transparent so the people of Wyoming understand where their money's being invested and how it's being invested. Mm-hmm. Had no idea that Peterson Institute was looking through those things. And they came back. It also sort of came about that I was considered one of the top 100 most influential
You weren't focused
managers.
On winning the awards.
I was not focused on that. I just wanted to do a better job for Wyoming.
Good. Great. So today, those investments now contribute about 25%, is that right, of our general expenditures?
Yeah, it's between 25 or as much as 30%. We've been the number one source of revenue when I was treasurer a couple of times. And it's a really nice shock absorber. Before 2008, obviously, there was a lot of stuff going on with the Great Recession. And luckily there, even though our investments did not perform well because nobody was doing well in that environment, coal prices were really good, so it really offset that. We've had the same thing. In 2016, we had the largest drop in revenue on the mineral extraction side, but we were able to bump up our returns off the investment portfolio to be able to balance those things out. And I think for people in Wyoming, we've had a boom and bust economy for so long that having that buffer in there is really, really important. So I think it's been a great godsend to Wyoming.
So from that position of treasurer, what makes you want to run for governor?
Wyoming is a fabulous state. Didn't really know who was going to step up at the time. I had it in my mind that now our current senator, Cynthia Lummis, was going to come back. She had been serving in the House, and she was going to come back and run for governor. And I was very supportive of that. Cynthia's a great leader, and I was really looking forward to continuing in that job to try to finish off some things that we had started, kind of making sure that our investment portfolio would continue to improve. When Cynthia called me and said, well, I'm not going to run for governor. And so it kind of hit me a little bit like a ton of bricks. And I said, well, I'm really concerned about where the state's going, need to have the history about where the state's come from, but also a vision about where it's going. And so I decided to step up and run.
And what have been some of your biggest challenges and surprises since taking on this role? Since getting elected, I should say.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Well, you know, your predecessor, Mark Northam, and I actually collaborated a lot on some of the stuff that helped us get our investment portfolio doing better. So then it was a matter of saying, okay, we need to diversify. Governor Meade had done something called the Endow Initiative. I really talked about making sure we had new industries here and everything else. So we set out with a fairly aggressive agenda on doing just that. We set up something called the Power Initiative, which was to sort of go around the state and understand and help people understand where our money came from, where the revenues were, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, I got a call from my colleague to the south, Governor Polis, who said, we've just closed all our ski resorts. You better be thinking about that too, because I think everybody's going to be coming to Wyoming. And I was like, cool. Why'd you do that? And he said, well, there's this little virus called COVID. Actually, we sort of knew it was in the offing. But that was the first big surprise, was having, you know, the entire nation shut down. Now, Wyoming stayed open. We got a lot of flack. I remember we were the first state to open Yellowstone Park, and there was a big Guardian article that said, there's Yellowstone, there's Old Faithful, not a mask in sight. Yep. Oh, the world's going to come to an end. It didn't, but I think those first 2 years were just trying to make sure that we kept people in work, that we kept revenues coming, that we kept businesses alive. We were able to hit the ground after that a little bit, and I'm sure this is what we're going to talk about. The end of COVID corresponded with the first year or so of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. So Trump administration was good for energy. Those last years were really tough economically because of COVID. Biden administration came in with an agenda that started out with all these EOs that were really designed to hold back fossil fuels.
EO being executive order.
Executive order, you bet.
So obviously, thanks for the transition to focus on energy. I think can't be governor of Wyoming without dealing a lot about energy. And Wyoming has it all. And I love to say we have produced and continue to produce more energy per capita than any other state, and it's not even close. And it's a great place to be working on energy. We have a lot of challenges, especially related to, as you mentioned, the current regulatory regime and policy environment. So how do you determine what issues are a priority, and how do you go about addressing them?
Well, it's been really fun to work with you over the years. And, you know, going back to when I was treasurer, you could see on the horizon this sort of harbinger of anti-fossil fuel sentiment that was beginning to mature. And the notion was we have climate change, and if we just stop, this is fairly shallow thinking, but if we just stop using fossil fuels, that, you know, the world will be better and everybody will be happy and we'll all have smiles. Not only was that potentially devastating to our economy and for the people that had careers here. And I always talk about careers more than jobs, because jobs are great. Yeah. But the point I try to make over and over again is that the careers that can be established with a robust marketplace for fossil fuels really have helped build towns. You know, you don't have the shock of people coming in and then leaving. So when the Biden administration came in, they came in with a very express position that we're going to stop using coal. Wyoming's the biggest coal exporter in the country. We have some, I think at that time, maybe 27 states. I think we're down to 25 now or something that depend on Wyoming coal. It's low sulfur coal. We were fighting to be able to get into Asian markets at the time. Even Washington, that kind of stymied our efforts there, had recognized that using Powder River coal would actually reduce CO2 emissions on the Pacific Rim if we could have exported it. And so kind of taking all of that together and saying, how can we protect this industry that's so key to, and we haven't even talked about oil and gas yet, but how can we protect this industry that's so key, that has so many people in careers and jobs? And lo and behold, you sort of take what people were throwing at you and you flip it on its head and you say, really, we can be part of the solution. If we can do carbon capture, something Wyoming has been doing since the 90s, if we can successfully do carbon capture and sequestration, we can continue to burn coal. We can do it reducing the emissions, And if we incorporate biomass from forests that are dead and dying, that are already off-gassing CO2, we can actually reduce that even more and maybe even go negative, not in terms of shutting off our industries, but in terms of preserving our industries while also reducing emissions.
Yeah.
So that's been the big challenge. I think that the most recent surprise has been kind of a pushback, which is sort of expected, but a pushback that doesn't see that as a potential solution.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's been tough to watch is the targeting of Wyoming, or really energy on federal lands by the feds, because that's all they can control. So in the last presidential debate, Vice President Harris was talking about how there's been more oil and gas production during this administration than before. But that is not because they have been helping that industry. And it's tough to watch in Wyoming in particular, because even knowing what I knew before I came here, I've been surprised how dedicated the state is to doing fossil fuel production really in an environmentally friendly way. And having federal regulations on federal lands often means that our federal minerals have the lowest footprint, whether it be, reclamation or greenhouse gases or whatever, than our competitors. And yet that's been, it feels like, targeted through leasing moratoriums and all. I mean, you name it. So on oil and gas in particular, there really has been an onslaught of federal regulations under this administration, the federal administration. So which ones, if you have to choose, are you most worried about and focused on the most?
Well, all the regulations have a limiting factor on our ability to produce energy. And as you've pointed out, Wyoming really has been a leader. We were the first ones to solve the listing of the sage-grouse. We have the best populations, we have the most robust birds, and yet that still seems to be something that's brought up over and over and over again. But nobody has a better plan than Wyoming, and Wyoming has been and continues to be successful. Migration corridors for big game. We were the first place to sort of say, hey, wait, the Red Desert, which is in the southwestern part of Wyoming, is really important for Yellowstone populations. We were the ones that did the studies. We were the ones that understood that, funded largely by the oil and gas companies. And then people said, well, let's draw lines on a map, and then we'll curtail all this other stuff. And we said, no. Really what we need to do is have an investment by all the stakeholders in making sure that this migration corridor works and that it's durable. We're working through that, but nobody else has got a better plan, and we've gotten that started. And to your point, when I was working for Apache, we were just beginning to think about doing directional drilling. I mean, people were doing it, but there wasn't the sort of sophistication that there is now. And you can co-locate well pads now and be able to drill 3 miles away, even 4, possibly 5. I mean, it is remarkable. So the impact on the landscape is de minimis compared to what it would have been before. Now, you compare that, and this is no indictment of any particular source because we need it all, but you compare that to a wind farm, which has to be, according to Basin Electric, 30% overbuilt, because you need to be able to provide that consistent power, which means you have to have, the wind isn't always blowing the same speed. You have to have more wind that can come online. So you're now talking about massive areas that are now stood up with, and west of Cheyenne, for example, it's just a forest of windmills. Changes the landscape, changes the wildlife habitat. And that goes almost double for large-scale solar, which, sort of blankets the landscape. And, people talk about, well, we can do things like raise them up and cows can hide underneath it. But anybody who's been around livestock remembers that they like to shade up, and when they shade up, they'll start to beat that down, and you'll start to get invasives. So there's a balance that's got to be achieved. And Wyoming has done that. I think, unfortunately, when you're in D.C. and your tool is let's stop fossil fuel development by not issuing leases, you now think at the D.C. level you've done something. But Governor Lujan Grisham of New Mexico and I, bipartisan, she's a Democrat, I'm a Republican, went to this administration early on and said, by doing that, you're not limiting fossil fuel production. You're just moving it. You're moving it to private lands. You're moving it to states that don't have federal land. And in the same time, you're hurting our populations, because that's how we fund our schools. That's how we take care of our roads. And so, to me, that thinking isn't very well developed, and it certainly doesn't understand how we need energy, and it certainly doesn't understand how we do this in a way that's beneficial to wildlife.
Yeah. You hurt the states with federal lands. You also hurt the nation because you've lost the national revenue, too.
Absolutely.
So at the School of Energy Resources, like the Wyoming Energy Authority, we're working on energy and minerals to support energy. One really exciting area for Wyoming right now is trona and the expansion of trona production in the state. And we're seeing a lot of growth. We have incredible resources in the state. So what excites you about the development in the trona patch, and how can the state support that growth?
Well, it is an industry that's a little bit less prone to this sort of conversation about we like fossil, we don't like fossil. It's a different industry. Bentonite is also a different industry. They both have markets well beyond. In the case of trona, it's a mineral that's used in so many different things, from glass to cosmetics to whatever. One of the things that I think is most interesting for Wyoming, and it's a reason why we should be able to talk about carbon reduction, we can produce trona at much less of a carbon footprint than what they can do in Europe or in China, which is where a lot of it is done. They have to process it with enormous amounts of BTUs. Our mineral just comes out and it's just ready to go.
And there's a synthetic, right? Whereas there's a natural.
Synthetic, yeah. And so, Wyoming, again, is the leader. And trona is down in the southwestern part of the state. It's the richest reserve of minerals of that type anywhere in the world. And from my standpoint, an industry that has huge upside to it. It's also leading the way, I think, in some power generation capacity, because they're uncertain where their market's going to come from, and they're kind of tied to a utility at this point. So they're actively out seeking if there are other ways that they can generate the kind of electricity they need to be able to run their mining operations.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue, because one of the areas they're looking at is nuclear energy and microreactors. And so this is really seeing a renaissance here in Wyoming and across the nation, nuclear energy. Of course, Wyoming is a long-time uranium producer. So we have a public that is generally more open to nuclear energy than maybe that you would see nationally. And that's what our polls show at the School of Energy Resources. In addition, of course, we have the TerraPower Natrium project that is under construction today. So what's your vision for nuclear energy? Where do you think we're going? And where do you like to see your administration playing in this space?
Well, for me, it's exciting to see an industry that has been an important component of Wyoming's economic sort of fabric for a long time. We had production in my town of KC. We had production around Gillette. We had production in Fremont County. It's kind of across the state. We've Converse County and others. And then that market collapsed because Russia was dumping fuel into the United States. And some of that came about. There's a long history to it, but it then became a very cheap source, and we got very dependent on it. And I think all of us have discovered why dependence on Russia is not a good idea.
Right.
So to see that our industry is starting to come back up is really exciting. We've led the way, I'm very happy to say, with TerraPower, which is a new, smaller, more modular, meaning that cost of construction hopefully will come down over time in multiple plants, and a whole different technology that, as you say, is broken ground in western Wyoming, hopefully the first of several projects and a great demonstration. We also have BWXT, another company that's even smaller. And you start thinking about how elegant maybe these solutions can be. Trona's one of them that can look at that. Small fishing villages in Alaska that otherwise depend on transporting kerosene a long ways through permafrost to try to get there. This is maybe a great alternative for that. So I think safety is obviously a big concern. We've come a long way since we started building these. What we do have is a modular plant, western Wyoming, pretty stable area from the point of seismology, and really a technology that can be sort of passively shuts down. So my vision, and if you look at this energy mix that we all talk about, Renewables are intermittent. They just are. Sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. There's batteries. They take a lot of minerals, a lot of processing and other things to make them. Wind doesn't blow all the time. Sometimes it blows excessively, other times not. But yet, if you have a data center, it's got to be up 24/7. We believe strongly that coal has a very large role to play there, but also uranium and nuclear have a big chance to be able to help fill that hole. And to your point, balancing these things from an environmental standpoint, you've got a pretty small footprint with those kind of dense power sources compared to this massive landscape scale footprint that comes from renewables.
Yeah. The other cool thing about the Natrium facility is it does incorporate heat storage in a way that will allow it to provide ramping, so it can address intermittency, can back up wind and solar, or it can just meet demand. It gets really cold in Wyoming. Everyone turns on their heater. Their fans are running. That heat storage can serve to boost plant output. So it's a big innovation in addition to the safety innovations that plant has. So it's super exciting. And we've talked wind and solar, especially wind, it's already a big part of Wyoming's energy mix today. So how do you see wind and solar contributing to Wyoming's energy sector?
Well, as you say, I think they're already part of it. They are going to be an important part of going forward. People nationwide, we export, I think on the Pacific Core line alone, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 63% of the electricity we generate is consumed by markets like California, by Washington, by Oregon, that they want, carbon. They say carbon free. I'm just going to say carbon neutral electrons because it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. But in any event, we can produce the clean power that they want to consume, continue to be a marketplace. That's good for people in Wyoming because they help pay for our schools and all that sort of stuff. But wind will continue to be a very big part of it. And there's a certain amount of, oh my gosh, my landscape is being changed. I used to have a beautiful view of the mountains and now I got all these windmills in front. There's some things we've got to sort out about that.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, if I'm a rancher and I have an oil and gas well in my pasture, hooray, that's great revenue for me. If I have a windmill in my pasture, hooray, that's good for me. So it's a good economic input to Wyoming, and I don't think we should ever turn our nose up at a particular source of energy. We can balance it better, and we are looking at different types of wind generation that may not be quite so large on the landscape, but still produce the same.
Yeah. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you how you think SER, School of Energy Resources, fits into helping Wyoming really drive its own energy future.
Well, SER has been an incredibly bright spot in this whole conversation. We talked about Wyoming's leadership over and over and over again. Actually going back to the Sovereign Wealth Fund piece when I was treasurer, talking to Mark Northam about, look, this is what Norway's done. How can we model some of this? And Mark's connections there and bringing some of that, saying here are the technologies that are coming. Obviously, a very big, important part that people might not always think about with the School of Energy Resources. But when I talk about carbon sequestration, when I talk about the types of technologies that can be brought to bear to make sure that coal remains an important part of our portfolio, when I look at how we can determine where the best opportunities lie for us to be able to develop these critical minerals or rare earths, wherever they may be. When I look at what we do kind of across the whole energy spectrum, Holly, it's the School of Energy Resources. People are invested in it. It has been fun to bring people from various companies like Marathon and others to take a look at what is going on at the School of Energy Resources. And I think what you and your colleagues have done there has kept our eyes open to innovation and better ways that we can use the resources we have in an environmentally friendly and more powerful way.
That's a relief. Well, we share your enthusiasm. We're so excited about what's happening. So in a broader sense, what's your vision for the future of Wyoming's energy sector? Is there anything we didn't touch on that you want to weigh in on?
Well, yeah, I'm just sort of tailing off on that last thing. I think also the other thing that's kind of fun This last year, you and I had a chance to talk to 60 Minutes about all the great stuff that's going on in Wyoming. I had a chance to go back to the belly of the beast, I call it, Harvard, and take some of the new coal-derived asphalt that had been developed. The School of Energy Resources could have taken a brick too, but the little core of asphalt was probably a little bit easier to pack, although precious. But just talking about, let's not shut down our opportunities and let's keep our minds open for what can come. And that's really where my vision lies. What are the things that we can possibly aspire to in Wyoming? We know we can develop coal the way we always have. We can do it better. And with nuclear, I think, you just look at what's happening in the energy sector. It's not clear to me that the old structure, or the old grid structure that was massive and kind of stretched multi-state, is still as viable as maybe having something that's more local. And it's to be sorted out, but Wyoming can kind of play in both of those as we go forward. I think the ability to point to our successes on the environmental side and our successes on the energy production side, I think those are the things that I'm very encouraged and optimistic about the rest of the world seeing and saying, gosh, I'd like to do it the way Wyoming does.
They should. Okay, so this podcast, like SCR, very creative. We like to talk about Wyoming, we like to talk about energy, and we like to talk about leadership. So let's just talk just for a minute about leadership. So what would you say your leadership style is?
I think if I were going to put a peg in it, I think it's basically hoping that I can find in people whatever it takes to get them to do what they think is the right thing to do. So we have an incredible cabinet here in Wyoming, and largely it's about getting out of their way, trying to provide some vision, I think, to whatever extent I can, but getting out of the way and just celebrating what they've been able to get accomplished.
Great answer. So I'm going to ask about a specific leadership moment that really inspired me. So you called me on the phone when the day I had a very close family member pass away, and it was unexpected. So I was very much in shock, and I was on the airplane I was at a work trip, and I was trying to get back to Wyoming to be with my family so we could go drive down to be at the services. And that was not a call I was expecting. It was not a call you had to make. And for some reason, I answered the phone. And you chose in that moment to take some of the load off of me when I was suffering. And I know you've done that for other people also. What makes you want to make calls like that?
Holly, people have rough moments. And I know it just, in Wyoming, we're all family, I think. But I think it's important to recognize people not only for what they do, but who they are. I know that was a particularly tough moment, and I think most people have had those moments.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing that. I don't know if you remember, you made me laugh, and just took a little bit of that burden off for that moment. So for our last question, we like to always end our podcast by asking our listeners to tell us about their favorite place in Wyoming. This could be fraught with danger for you. You have to pick a place as the governor. But if you're willing to answer, we want to stick with our tradition. What would you say is a place that you would love to be in Wyoming, or what's your favorite place to visit? So
there's a mountain that is just off the edge of Cloud Peak, which is a beautiful, I say this a little bit hesitantly because the Bighorns are a special gift to Wyoming. I mean, there's lots of mountains that are wonderful in Wyoming. But it's a funny little mountain called the Merlon, and it's a mountain I was one of the potential first ascents. There's some doubt about whether an initial party had actually summited. They had a fatality on their climb. We didn't. But sitting, this is going to sound strange, on the next to last pitch, there's a little belay spot that you're sitting on, and looking out to the east, and you can see the Powder River, and you can see the Pumpkin Buttes. And on a beautiful day, which it was that particular day, you could see Devil's Tower out to the end. And you realize this glorious landscape that we have, and all the benefits and all the gifts that we've been given, that will always stick with me as a favorite spot.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, for answering this, for engaging with the School of Energy Resources, and for all you do.
Thanks, Holly. It's great to be here.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.